My name is Steve Burt. I'm the Homeless Management Information Systems Administrator with the Continuum of Care team at the United Way. This program this morning came together as a result of years of conversations about concerns over those experiencing homelessness here in Wichita. At the United Way, our Continuum of Care team works diligently to ensure that a homelessness response system exists, such that homelessness in our community is rare, brief, and non-recurring. While we have been working to build that system, we have come to understand that low stock of accessible and affordable housing in our community contributes to individuals newly experiencing homelessness in our community, but as well as it impacts outflow. So those who are homeless and we're trying to connect them to housing resources, sometimes it makes it more difficult and takes more time because of the low housing stock. Last December, we brought in a consultant named Julia Orlando, who came from a community in Bergen County, New Jersey, that was the first in the nation to reach what's called functional zero for both veterans and chronically homeless individuals. What we learned is that our goal of reaching functional zero for our homeless neighbors is both attainable, it's best practice at the same time. HUD wants us to use our resources in a way that actually moves needles and ends and reduces homelessness. And that's what functional zero is all about. What it means to be functional zero is that a homeless response system exists such that when an individual falls into homelessness, the resources from shelter to housing navigation to financial assistance exists to put them into a permanent housing situation within a short period of time. Let me provide a real example of how a system to end homelessness for an identified subpopulation works in Wichita. In our January point in time count, we identified 49 veteran households that were experiencing literal homelessness on that day. In July, a joint announcement was made by the city, county, VA, and the United Way that we are establishing a goal of reaching functional zero for veterans by the end of 2024. Since that time, we have seen a 45% reduction in veteran homelessness. Our community number of veterans experiencing literal homelessness right now stands at 27, and we're meeting 2 of the 4 official benchmarks for ending homelessness for veterans. That's worth a round of applause for all of you who do that work. The VA over here, Kenny and Cindy, thank you so much for all your hard work. The federal benchmarks that we're working to achieve are, number 1, every homeless veteran in our community has a housing-first housing plan and is working with a case manager. Number 2, there are no long-term or chronically homeless veterans outside of that 90-day window of looking for a housing opportunity. While there are 27 homeless veterans in our community, 5 of those households are experiencing long-term and/or chronic homelessness. So we want to get to zero. We have 5 of those, but we're all still working to house all 27. Number 3, outflow exceeds inflow. In the last 90 days, our system has identified 33 veterans experiencing literal homelessness. We housed 40. That's a benchmark we're hitting. The average time from identification of their homelessness to housing is 90 days or less is the benchmark. Anyone want to take a guess where we were at 2 days ago when I most recently ran this number? Anyone want to take a guess? Don't say anything. Anyone? 45? It's 91.1. That says a couple of things. Number 1, it's over the 90-day mark, so it doesn't hit the benchmark. But number 2, that's how drilled down we are on the details. And that's what it's going to take to end homelessness, the details. By operationalizing a system to end homelessness, one population at a time, we are able to ensure that that system is replicable to other populations and is sustainable and not just a one-time event. The next subpopulation that we're going to be working on is chronic homelessness, but we've been building that system simultaneously from the lessons we're learning about building the system to end veteran homelessness. Through all of this, one thing has become abundantly clear, is that we will neither be able to reach functional zero, nor will we be able to sustain it off the current housing resources that we have available in our community at this time. The lack of affordable housing in Wichita impacts the homelessness response system in 2 very important ways, as I previously said. Number 1, inflow. So we've got to go up the chain to find out what might be driving homelessness in the first place. And Dr. Colburn is going to speak a little bit about that. So it affects inflow. lack of affordable housing stock contributes to homelessness. But number two, where are we going to place those experiencing homelessness when we want them housed? So it impacts and slows down outflow at the same time. Last year, there was a book published called Homelessness is a Housing Problem, written by a University of Washington professor by the name of Gregg Colburn. In it, he studied several cities across the United States and made a comparison between the number of unhoused individuals each city has and the cost and availability of housing. Though we may not be in as much of a critical state as other cities, particularly on the coasts, we are seeing increases here, and we believe that this is imperative to get ahead of it. Gregg Colburn is an associate professor in the Runstad Department of Real Estate in the College of Built Environments at the University of Washington. He publishes research on topics related to housing and homelessness and is co-author of the book, Homelessness is a Housing Problem, How Structural Factors Explain U.S. Patterns, published by the University of California Press. His research has been featured in leading media outlets, including The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Economist, Bloomberg, and National Public Radio. Gregg holds a BA from Albion College, an MBA from Northwestern University, and an MSW and PhD from the University of Minnesota. Prior to academia, he worked as an investment banker and private equity professional. At the University of Washington, Gregg teaches classes in housing, urban economics, and finance. Gregg serves as the co-chair of the University of Washington's Homelessness Research Initiative and is a member of the National Alliance to End Homelessness Research Council. We are so excited that Dr. Colburn has agreed to join us today and present his findings. I'd like to introduce and have us give a warm welcome to our featured speaker and guest, Dr. Gregg Colburn.
Good morning. Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. It's fun to be here, and I will say it's particularly fun because this is the last speaking engagement of 2023 for me. I've done about 75 of these this year. So I woke up this morning, I was like, I made it. But it's fun to come to communities that are doing really good work. I kind of joke like I'm a character from a Dickens novel, The Ghost of Christmas to Come, which is, please don't do what we did on the coast. And the problems that we have right now are long-standing. It's been decades in the making, and so fixing it becomes very, very difficult. So I have spent, since publishing this book, way more time in the middle of the country than I thought. I thought I'd go to Seattle and San Francisco and LA and maybe Boston, and that would be the end of it. And I've been to Indiana, and I've been to Iowa, and I've been to Kansas, and I've been to Kentucky, and I've been to Orlando, and all over the place. And these are fun communities because you have a challenge that is absolutely solvable. And so I feel much better walking out of these rooms than when I'm in Los Angeles. The scale of the problem in Los Angeles is overwhelming. And they're doing really, really good work, but the inflow is just, it's brutal. It's absolutely brutal. So my hope for your community is that you can learn from the mistakes that we have made, not replicate them, and move forward more productively. So I moved to Seattle in 2017 with my family to begin my work at University of Washington. And because I study housing and homelessness, I quickly got invited to all sorts of community meetings on the topic. And if you haven't been to Seattle recently, it's really a shame what has happened. We have a terrible, terrible housing crisis and homelessness crisis that has meaningfully changed the character of the city. It's an awesome, beautiful place, and it has really changed it. And I would sit in these meetings and listen because I was new, and I just wanted to take it in, and people would talk about all these different explanations. And I would leave these meetings and scratch my head and say, I don't think we understand what's going on. Residents of Seattle read the Seattle Times, they walk around downtown and say, what the heck is going on? We're spending all this money, the problem's getting worse, and public confidence in our collective ability to solve the problem was eroding. And as someone who studies public policy and cares about public policy, that concerned me because eroding public confidence then limits our ability to do big, important things. And unfortunately, given the scale of the problem, we need to do big, important things that cost money. And public will and support for that decreases if the perception is that we don't know what's going on. And so the purpose of the book was really to translate what we've known in the academic literature for some time, which is homelessness is complicated. And we want to understand what some of the root causes of this crisis are such that we can focus our time, attention, and resources on the very cause, rather than playing whack-a-mole with different explanations every day. And that's what we were doing. You whack one day and something else pops up. And if you read the Seattle Times, and I've had some issues with the Seattle Times folks when they write articles, consumers of that media are understandably confused because there's a different article every day. And you could easily understand, oh, there's a drug problem, there's a mental illness problem, there's a poverty problem, there's a laziness problem, there's a housing problem. I don't know. And that's where we are as a city and frankly as a nation. So that was kind of the motivation for writing the book. That's the book. So if you're going to write a book about homelessness, obviously we need to engage with the idea of causation. What causes homelessness? And that's a complicated question. So in graduate school, I spent a lot of time in classes called causal inquiry, which you can imagine at 8:30 in the morning what that's like. But it's really important work in understanding what causes X. And we have all sorts of techniques and ways of knowing. In the physical sciences, sometimes causation is a lot easier. If we drop a pencil, we know that gravity causes that. The social world is complicated because human beings are complicated. Right? What causes someone to get into Harvard? Well, it's complicated. He or she might be really smart. Maybe their grandparents gave $100 million to Harvard. Maybe they're a really good hockey player. I'm from Minnesota, so I can make hockey jokes. Okay? The point is it's complicated. Human beings are complicated. Social systems are complicated. Homelessness is arguably one of the most complex systems and phenomenons that I've seen. I've never experienced homelessness. I've never experienced housing insecurity. So that's my situation in all this. And so I have to put that up front because there are plenty of people who've had that experience. But one of the ways that we understand homelessness is we ask people experiencing homelessness, why are you homeless? And these surveys happen when we do the point in time count every January. I highly recommend you work with your CoC and support this. It's really important work. And I actually, the first time I did this was in Minneapolis. I mentioned this last night, probably, well, close to 10 years ago now. 2 in the morning, walk around the middle of the night in Minneapolis in January. You can understand what that is like, and that certainly puts things into perspective. And when we ask people experiencing homelessness about why they are there, they give us very honest and blunt answers. My boyfriend beat me up and I ran. Right? I made some bad choices. I drink too much. I got in a fight with my roommate. She kicked me out and I have nowhere to go, and here I am. And so we honor these explanations, we publish them and say, here are some of the factors that cause people to be homeless, and Seattle Times gets a hold of them and says, here's the causes of homelessness. And I sit in my office and go, Who am I to tell someone that's not why they're homeless? That's not my position, that's not Gregg's position. But I also understand that these personal factors overlay onto structure. And we know from the academic literature that access to housing is a causal driver of homelessness. So when I started to think about this book, I spent a lot of time wrestling with this very idea. How do I then have Gregg walk in and say, it's the housing market, when people are saying it's domestic violence? So the point is not that this is wrong and that's right or vice versa. They both can be true. So what we try to do in the book is honor both explanations, and we call one a precipitating event and we call one a root cause. Both are important. And the way we highlight the difference between these two is this metaphor. I learned partway through that this is a metaphor, not an analogy, for those of you who are English teachers. Okay? Gets all sorts of helpful feedback when you write a book. Imagine a game of musical chairs. You have 10 friends and 10 chairs. They show up. There's a leader who starts the music. They start walking around in a circle. The leader pulls one chair out. When the music stops, everyone scrambles for a chair. And in this case, Mike, who was on crutches after spraining an ankle, loses the game. He was unable to move quickly when the music stopped, lost the game, and was left without a chair. So if we interviewed Mike after the game and said, Mike, why did you lose? What would he say? I had a bad ankle. And everyone would nod. Of course, that was the cause of Mike losing the game. And so if we go back to kind of this causal argument, clearly within the rules of the game, that probably did cause Mike to lose. But if we take a step back and say, why didn't Mike have a chair? Because he didn't have enough chairs. If we had 10 chairs, Mike would have found a chair. It might have taken him longer. He would have hobbled over on his crutches, sat down, and had a chair. This is exactly what is happening in our coastal cities right now, which is when housing is scarce, when there are not enough chairs, people who are vulnerable will lose the game. So in Seattle, finding housing is like playing musical chairs with Usain Bolt, the Jamaican sprinter, fastest man in the world. He's going to win every time. Do you really think you're going to outbid Amazon people for housing? If you're making $20,000 a year in Seattle, there's no chance. There's no chance. So this doesn't mean that ankle injuries aren't important. This doesn't mean that poverty or mental illness or drug use isn't important. The point is that we need to overlay that on structure to explain why places like Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, New York, and DC have really, really, really high rates of homelessness. So one of the takeaways that people have from my talks, which is an incorrect takeaway, is that Gregg doesn't think drugs are a problem. That is not the point of the talk. I would ask that you please not exit saying that. Drugs are absolutely a causal driver of homelessness at the individual level. If you're addicted, you're more likely to experience homelessness, no doubt about it. That's true for poverty, it's true for mental illness. And we could fill this room with research demonstrating that. But we also know that those conditions produce high rates of homelessness in some contexts, like in Boston, and not in other places, which could cause us then to ask the question of what's going on here. And that's what we try to do in the book. So the question we pose in the book, it's a pretty simple question, which is why do rates of homelessness, and these are per capita rates, it's not absolute rates, per capita rates of homelessness, why do they vary so widely throughout the United States? And we ask that question because if we can provide a credible response to that question, it should tell us something fundamental about the nature of this phenomenon. And a plausible explanation, if you've been paying attention, is if we have individual risk factors, drugs, mental illness, and poverty, if those are the individual risk factors, if you have more people with those conditions in your city, you'll have more homelessness. That's a perfectly logical explanation for regional variation. Turns out it's not true. So this is a book about cities. It's not a book about people, and this doesn't mean that person-focused research isn't important. It absolutely is. And we have lots of research on individual people. This is a city about trying to explain what the heck is going on in Seattle. And the thesis is that tight housing markets accentuate individual vulnerabilities and produce homelessness at much higher rates. And these individual vulnerabilities that get a lot of attention in the popular press and in just personal narratives are really sorting mechanisms. They're identifying the people who are most likely to experience homelessness when housing is scarce. Both matter. Both are important. Both deserve our attention, but we need to understand how these two things interact with one another. Okay, so the sample in our book is the 30 largest metro areas in the United States. And if we're going to write a book about regional variation, I want to demonstrate for you that, in fact, there is regional variation. And I'm going to move over in a moment and kind of point some things out on these slides. So for those of you in the corners, you might not be able to see what I'm doing. I apologize. But this is looking at all the cities in our sample. And these are per capita rates of homelessness. This is high homelessness. This is low homelessness. And it's nice to talk to a CoC. People know what a CoC is, and so I don't have to go into that. As you know, some CoCs count at the city level. The New York City CoC just covers New York City. There are other CoCs like yours that cover a county. The reason why that's important is per capita rates of homelessness in county-based CoCs will be lower, all else equal, than cities because homelessness congregates in the urban core. County-based CoCs are including suburban locations. So what we can't do when we compare rates of homelessness, which happens all the time in the press, if you've noticed this, people will compare King County, which is Seattle, to New York City, and I'll say you can't do that. You're comparing a county to a city. So what we need to do is compare cities to cities. What you'll see is there's about 9 cities up there. New York, DC, San Francisco, and Boston are about 10 per capita per 1,000 people, and Indianapolis is about 2. So it's a 5-to-1 relationship. Huge variation. We're not trying to explain 20% differences here. We're talking about 5 times. We should want to understand why New York is 5 times Indianapolis. When we go to counties, the numbers are lower for the reasons that I already articulated because of the suburban phenomenon. But interestingly, the relationship is still 5-to-1. And I can't see quite that far. LA County, Santa Clara County, King County, which is my county, and Multnomah, which is Portland, are about 5 times Hillsborough, which is Tampa. Again, huge variation. So that's what we're trying to explain. And the logic of the book is we take all the conventional explanations for homelessness and we test using pretty simple statistics. Does it help us understand regional variation? If it doesn't, we cross it off and we move to the next one. And we just make our way through these various arguments and see, does it help us understand what's going on? If it doesn't, we move on and we ultimately get to the end. And as a spoiler, it's related to housing, if you hadn't figured that out. So individual explanations. These are the ones that get the most attention in the newspaper, and if you're just walking down the street and ask people what causes homelessness, this is what they would say. So we're going to test to see if this helps us understand this variation. All right. It's 8:53, and you see a lot of things on this chart. So This is looking at the relationship between poverty and rates of homelessness. Each of the dots on this graph, on this figure, is one city or county in a given year. And it's showing the relationship between the rate of poverty in that community, the percentage of people below the federal poverty line. That's the x-axis or the bottom axis. And then the y-axis is rates of homelessness. So this would be high poverty, low homelessness, high homelessness. The line through it is just a regression line, which is showing the relationship between the two. As that becomes more vertical, it's a stronger relationship. When it's flat and this r squared is 0, it's basically no relationship. It's just dots on a page. So what this poverty one shows us is there's actually a modest statistical relationship between poverty and homelessness, but it's in the opposite direction of what we would expect. It's downward sloping. What this is saying is that places with really high rates of poverty have low rates of homelessness, which is a total head scratcher because I just told you that poverty causes homelessness. So this collection of dots here is Detroit, Michigan, which is the most impoverished city in the United States, much higher rates of poverty than any other place in the United States, and far lower rates of homelessness than really affluent cities like Seattle and San Francisco and Boston. Those are the 3 most affluent cities in the United States. They also have the 3 highest rates of homelessness in the United States. So the point of this slide is not that poverty doesn't matter. Poverty absolutely matters, but homelessness thrives amidst affluence, not amidst poverty. It's easier if you're poor to figure it out in Detroit than it is in Seattle. Getting to $700 a month is doable. Getting to $1,800 a month, not going to happen. Okay? So we can't blame homelessness in Seattle and San Francisco and Boston on disproportionate numbers of poor people. In fact, we have fewer poor people. The consequences of being poor in a rich place are significant, and that's what this slide tells us. This is mental illness. These data come from the state level. The feds keep the data on mental illness and substance use disorders. And so this is the same logic, though. It's the rate of serious mental illness in every state in the nation from 2007 to 2019. And what you'll see is there's some variation in rates of mental illness, and it bears 0 relationship to rates of homelessness. We do not have a homelessness problem in the state of Washington because we have disproportionate numbers of people experiencing mental illness. It's not true. Do we have people experiencing mental illness? Of course we do. Just as Kansas does, just as Indiana does, just as New York does. Every state in the nation has people experiencing mental illness. The consequences of that are different from state to state. So we do not have more mentally ill people, and that's not why we have a huge problem in Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, et cetera. Is it more visible? Do people see more mental illness? Of course. Of course. But it's not disproportionate numbers. This is drug use, substance use disorders. There are people using and abusing drugs in every state in the nation at varying rates, and that variation bears 0 relationship to homelessness rates. I've learned if you write a book about homelessness that you get lots of angry emails, and I've developed a thick skin. I actually have a folder in my email inbox of angry emails, and I've actually joked that I'm going to write a second book about the responses to this book. And a lot of times they include 4-letter words that aren't love. Okay? This really gets people angry. It's really interesting. I've actually been, it's been, like initially I would just get really mad, and then I was like, this is really interesting that this is eliciting this type of response from people. It's really fascinating. We are not saying that drug use doesn't matter. What we're saying is people use drugs in every state in the nation. Do you think people use drugs in Chicago? They do. Chicago has 1/5 the homelessness of Seattle. And if you fundamentally think this is a drug problem, you need to explain West Virginia for me. It's the home of the opioid epidemic in the United States. It has ravaged that state. Highest overdose deaths in the United States, West Virginia. So if you fundamentally believe this is a drug problem, we should see massive amounts of homelessness in West Virginia, and we don't. And we don't see massive amounts of homelessness in Tennessee and Kentucky and Mississippi and Arkansas and other places that have had huge opioid problems. So this is not to minimize the scourge of drugs and opioids. We have a fentanyl crisis in Seattle that scares the crap out of me. The point is, though, that we do not have a disproportionate number of drug users in Seattle. We have a problem with homelessness there because we have individual factors colliding with a really inhospitable housing market. I say this, and I wish I did. If I had a magic wand and could end all addiction and mental illness in Seattle tomorrow, it'd be wonderful. We'd still have a problem with homelessness. It doesn't go away. Okay? Because I argue this is a housing problem does not mean I don't think treatment is important. We absolutely have to provide treatment. I think we have a moral obligation to provide treatment for people who need it. Mental health treatment, drug and alcohol treatment, obviously. It's part of the full story. Okay, race. We can't write a book, we can't talk about homelessness without talking about disproportionality in terms of the racial composition of people experiencing homelessness. In the United States, Black, brown, indigenous people are 3 to 4 times overrepresented in the population of people experiencing homelessness. But what's interesting is when you plot the demographics of cities, it doesn't help us understand regional variation. Chicago has a far higher Black population than Seattle, yet has far lower rates of homelessness. So being Black doesn't cause homelessness. Racism causes homelessness. Okay? So race interacts with racist systems to produce disproportionality, and those are in healthcare and education and housing and the labor market and all these things, and this has been going on for 400 years in our country. And that's why we have higher homelessness among Black people than white people. And that's true in a disproportionately white city like Seattle. Black people are about 3.8 times overrepresented, and in a much higher population of Black people in Chicago, it's also 3.8 times. From a different base. So race and racism helps us understand who is more likely to experience homelessness within a given city. It doesn't help us understand why Seattle, San Francisco, and Los Angeles have higher rates than other places. Okay, so none of these individual explanations do a good job, actually they don't do a good job at all, of helping us understand regional variation. So we have to keep looking. So now let's go to some local contextual factors. And this is what I would call cocktail party fodder here. Okay. Greg, the West Coast has lots of homelessness because we have really nice weather. And wouldn't you rather be homeless in LA than Chicago? Tell me if you've heard this before. I've heard this 83,462 times. Okay. Total rates of homelessness are people living in shelter and people who are living outside of the shelter system. When you look at total rates of homelessness and weather, there is zero statistical relationship whatsoever. Is LA warm? Yes. Is LA warmer than Chicago? Yes. That does not mean it's a credible explanation. Boston is terribly cold in January and has super high rates of homelessness, as does New York. We also have cities like Miami and San Antonio and Phoenix with lower rates of homelessness that are also warm in January. So it's a convenient explanation. Everyone loves to blame Mother Nature, but we can't blame Mother Nature. There's something else going on. Greg, if our city was not so generous, we wouldn't have all these people moving here to experience homelessness. This is the fundamental problem in our city. I first heard this argument in Minneapolis. People were blaming people from Chicago coming to Minneapolis. That was our homelessness problem. We studied it and found no evidence. My first meeting in Seattle, well, you know, we're generous, Greg. I said, well, that's what Minneapolis said. Where are your people coming from? California. I was like, okay. So I go to California. I've been to California so many times in the last couple years. They said, you know, we have a problem with homelessness because we're super generous. I said, well, what do you mean? They said, yeah, people are moving here. I said, you can't. You're shipping your people to Seattle. I already learned that. Okay. Where are your people coming from? Texas. Everyone loves to blame Texas for everything. Okay. Middletown, Ohio believes that they're a magnet for homelessness. We read about this in the book. Everyone believes they're a magnet. Everyone can't be the recipient. That's not the way magnets work. Okay? So there are a couple of reasons beyond anecdote that we can demonstrate that this is not, in fact, the case. This is TANF, which is the primary federal welfare program, largely for women and children. TANF came into being in 1996 under President Clinton's welfare reform. One of the attributes of TANF reform was huge state-to-state variation. There are stingy states, there are generous states. It's part of the movement to devolve decision-making to states. So what we can see is, do we see people congregating in states that have really generous TANF benefits? And what we see from this slide is no, there's zero relationship. People are not saying, look at the TANF benefits in Iowa, I think I'm going to move to Iowa. Okay. And this is not to suggest that I think generous benefits are bad. No, I actually think generous benefits are good. The point is that people are not optimizing their geographic location based on relatively minimal welfare benefits. It's just not true. We also know that state-to-state mobility among people with very low incomes is actually quite low. Why? Moving is hard. We moved a family of 4 to Seattle in 2017, 2 middle schoolers, and it was painful. We didn't know anyone, new job, new schools for the kids, had to find housing, the whole 9 yards, and we had every advantage under the sun. Now imagine you have nothing and you're going to do that. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. Social networks are really important to all of us. If your mom is the only one who's going to take care of your kid in Seattle, are you going to move to Topeka? Because it's more affordable? No chance. No chance. One, how are you going to get to Topeka? What are you going to do when you get there and you don't have any social network? Okay. So we have lots of research demonstrating that this is not true. It doesn't stop us from saying it, though, all the time. Okay. We have to look ourselves in the mirror and understand that this is a homegrown problem. And therefore, we have responsibility to fix it ourselves. Colleagues at University of California, San Francisco just published an awesome study of homelessness in California. They found that 90% of the people in California experiencing homelessness are from California. We got to look in the mirror. Now, the problem is that we have people and journalists and other folks who will walk around and ask people where you're from. If someone stopped me on the street in Seattle and said, Greg, where are you from? I'd say, I'm from Minnesota. I cheer for the Vikings. I've lived here for 7 years. But I still don't think of myself as from Seattle. So if a journalist asked me, and then if I were experiencing homelessness, I'd be like, there are people from Minnesota moving here. That's not the story. I've lived here for 7 years. This is not a mobility story. I do consider myself a Minnesotan. Okay? So we have to be careful about the questions that we're asking. Okay? This is not a mobility story. Is there an anecdote to the contrary? Of course. But we shouldn't legislate based on anecdote. Just because one person moved from Texas to Los Angeles shouldn't mean we should upend our entire homeless response system because of one story. Okay, politics. Seattle, San Francisco, and LA are run by Democrats, therefore Democrats are causing homelessness. Okay? The purpose of this slide is not to say that Democrats are blameless. Democrats actually have a lot to answer for, especially in coastal cities, in terms of housing production and regulatory environment. But the idea that this is just permissive policies causing homelessness to flourish doesn't hold water. Because Democrats, and this may be good news or bad news for some of you, and that's probably a topic for a different book, but Democrats run cities in the United States. A couple of exceptions, San Diego, Miami have had Republican mayors. Bloomberg was an independent when running New York, but generally speaking, Democrats run cities. So if you want to blame city Democrats for homelessness, you need to explain why Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, St. Louis, Baltimore, cities that have been run by Democrats longer than I've been alive haven't produced massive crises of homelessness. Okay? So the story here is these simple explanations usually just don't hold up. Usually don't hold up. So there's more going on. All right, now to the main event. Now we're going to test and see how housing market conditions associate with rates of homelessness. This is median contract rents. And what you'll see is a very strong statistical relationship between rents and homelessness. Dun, dun, dun. Okay? Rents are high, homelessness is high. Vacancy rates. When vacancy rates get below 5%, 5% is kind of the neutral point for vacancy rates. Below 5%, urban economists would suggest that you have a deficit of rental housing. Because of friction, like unemployment, you never get to zero. You know, you leave, and then it's empty for a little bit, and I move in, and so that just happens throughout society. So below 5% would suggest that you have a deficit of rental housing, and when you see vacancy rates go down, you see homelessness goes up. And so if people are like, I don't really buy this, my response is, give me a city that has really high rents and low vacancies that doesn't have a problem with homelessness. There isn't one. So is it a perfect predictor? I would never suggest that it is, but it's pretty darn good. It's really hard to find a counterexample that doesn't fit this narrative. So if this is really important, if these housing market conditions are really important, we should want to ask the question and understand what causes really high rents and low vacancies. How can we as a community either end that or prevent it? If you were to walk around Seattle and ask people why we have a housing crisis, most people would say Amazon. Amazon has imported hundreds of thousands of people over the last decade, paid them a whole bunch of money, and it has blown up our housing market. I can say when we were searching for a house in 2017, we'd walk into these houses that are terribly expensive. And there would be people bidding all cash $700,000 over the asking price. So has Amazon had an impact? Absolutely. Absolutely. But what's interesting is when you plot population growth, which is a proxy for housing demand, more people, more demand for housing, when you plot population growth and homelessness, you don't see a relationship. This confused me when I first ran it. I thought I'd messed things up. So I went into these dots to kind of understand what was going on. What I realized is that there are plenty of cities growing quickly in the United States that aren't having the same problems as Seattle and San Francisco and Boston. And what I realized with this relatively simple analysis is I was ignoring the supply side. Clearly, demand for housing is an important part of the story, but we also need to understand what's happening with the supply of housing. So if you took economics at some point in your life, you might be having nightmares about the notion of elasticity. It's all coming back to you now. Supply elasticity is a really important idea and concept when we talk about housing. And the idea of supply elasticity is when prices for a good change, what's the response of the market? Do suppliers produce a lot more of that good? So if the price of this clicker goes up 10 times tonight, the people who make these clickers are going to pop some champagne tonight and say, this is awesome. And what are they going to do tomorrow? They're going to make a whole bunch of clickers. We're going to go 2 shifts, 3 shifts, et cetera. And within a week or two, we're going to see a whole bunch of these in the store shelves. The elasticity of this product is pretty high. When the price of housing goes up 10 times, if it did, I hope it doesn't. If it went up 10 times in Wichita tonight, what happens tomorrow to housing supply? Nothing. Because housing takes a long time to build. We need land, we need a permit, we need financing, we need a contractor, all this kind of stuff. So generally speaking, housing is less elastic than clickers. And we also know from urban economists that that elasticity in cities varies based on 2 factors. One is the topography. If you have mountains and water, it's a lot harder to build housing. You are not constrained topographically in Kansas. Okay? The other factor is the regulatory environment. How easy is it to build housing? There are places where it's easy to build housing and other places that are really, really hard. The anecdote that I share is I just got an email from a friend in San Francisco who told me that it's 700 days to get a permit to build housing in San Francisco right now. Okay? And people are dying in the streets. It's totally unacceptable, in my opinion. And I'm not anti-regulation. I think there's a role for regulation in a healthy society. I want my ground beef to be safe. Okay? I want people to live in housing that's safe and secure. But there's a reasonable ground between reasonable regulation and taking 2 years to permit housing in a city that needs housing more than any city in the United States, San Francisco, California. Okay? And so if you combine challenging topography like mountains and water in San Francisco with a really strict regulatory environment, you end up with a really inelastic housing supply. And when you pair a population boom with really inelastic housing supply, what do you get? You get a housing crisis and a homelessness crisis. So on this graph, the bottom axis, the x-axis, is a change in population. So think about this as demand for housing. The cities on the right would be places where there's lots of demand for housing. A lot of people have moved there. On the left, you have the Rust Belt, which have actually experienced declines in population. The y-axis, the vertical axis, is supply elasticity. 1 is the neutral point for supply elasticity. Above 1 would suggest that you have an elastic housing supply, meaning you build a lot of housing. Below 1 is inelastic, meaning you don't build a lot of housing when prices go up. So the upper right quadrant is the Sun Belt, which is really interesting. These are places that have grown rapidly. Charlotte's grown just as fast as Seattle. But they've not had the same experience with housing crisis. Why? They built a lot of housing. They have a really elastic housing supply. Now, a lot of these communities have accommodated growth through sprawl, and some people might say that's probably maybe not the ideal way of doing this, but it does demonstrate that if you build housing, you can maintain a more reasonable housing market. The numbers in parentheses are the rental market vacancy rates. So what you'll see in those Sunbelt cities is despite rapid population growth, they've been able to maintain more reasonable rental market vacancy rates, which also means their housing has stayed more affordable. The bottom right portion of this graph is the perfect storm for a housing and homelessness crisis. You layer a tech boom on top of really inelastic housing supply, and what do you get? Super low vacancy rates. You can see the numbers are in the 3s. That is an incredibly unhealthy housing market. And we've been in the 3s for over a decade in those cities. It's brutal. And what happens is that just supercharges rents. And rents go up, and all of a sudden it's $2,500 to rent a 1-bedroom in Seattle, and if you're making 20 grand a year, what's going to happen? There's no shot. No shot. And we have a homelessness crisis. And if you're addicted, it's even harder. Right? And so that's how we see these things coming together and producing these outcomes. Okay, so a couple updates. So we ended in 2019 with our data. The book was published in 2022. We went through a pandemic, and we have all this other stuff going on. So the question you might have is, okay, what's happened since? The general story is looking at the data is, one is data has been disrupted because of the pandemic. It's true in the census, it's true in the point in time count on homelessness. And so there's going to be forever a period of time where we have to take take it with a grain of salt. And the 2023 numbers are going to be coming out here in December. based on what I've heard from the feds on this. Generally speaking, the logic of the book is holds with the data post-2019. The big cities are still the big cities. That has not changed. But what's also emerged is we have some other cities and communities that are flashing red lights, warning signs. And those are Phoenix, Travis County, Austin. Austin has blown up. If you read the newspaper in Austin, it's housing and homelessness almost every day. And that's because of a tech boom. And they have actually grown. They've increased their housing supply. They just have not been able to keep up. Sacramento County is going through terrible, terrible problems. People are leaving the Bay Area and going to Sacramento. And then Atlanta is seeing some pressures. And Atlanta has actually been pretty good for a long time. So unfortunately, the logic of the book still holds. And more cities are now in the camp of having difficulty. What do we know about your community? You are fortunately not in the situation of one of these flashing red signals, but you are going in the wrong direction, as many other communities are. I have been shocked when I pull up the census data, when I go to places like Iowa and Kansas and Indiana, seeing what's going on in the housing market. The statewide vacancy rate in the state of Iowa is 5.1% right now. I would have lost so much money before I pulled up that census data. I would have said it's going to be 7.5%, 8%. So what we're seeing is in many states, even in the interior of the country, a compression in the housing market. Your vacancy rates have gone from about 8.2% over the last decade to 5.8% in 2022. That's a pretty rapid tightening of your housing market. That's going to exert pressures on your rents. Your rents are up about 35% in both the county and the city over the last decade. I've seen 50 in a lot of places, so you're doing better than that. But it's still, that is exerting pressure on folks in your community, and we're seeing homelessness inch up a little bit. It's still at 1.3, you're not at 5 like Seattle, which is great, and all of you in this room should be commended for that. But these forces are pretty powerful. As I say, math is undefeated. If you continue to have a housing market move in that direction, the work that you're all doing in this room will continue to get harder and harder. And so it doesn't mean that we shouldn't have a crisis response system for homelessness. We should, but we also need to focus on our housing production to ensure that you have adequate housing for the people who are moving to your community and those who've called it home for a long time. If you don't, you're not going to like the outcomes in 5 or 10 years. And I can say, based on meeting with a lot of governors and mayors in big cities on the West Coast, it's a heck of a lot easier to deal with it right now than it is on the other end. The scale of investment and intervention we need in Washington and California right now is off the charts. And I'm very skeptical that we will marshal the resources needed to end this. Right now, we're just trying to make sure it doesn't get worse. The idea of us moving back down, getting to one times or one per capita, not going to happen. I hope I'm wrong. But all evidence would suggest that we're not going to get there. So, Greg, we've spent all this money on homelessness. The problem got worse. Obviously, what we're doing isn't working. Have you heard this story? One of the problems and one of the concerns I have when people raise those issues is there are two things that we're not thinking about. One is the counterfactual. What would have happened had we not made these investments? And what I'll generally tell you is the problem would be a heck of a lot worse than it would be right now. You're not seeing it because it's a counterfactual. It didn't exist. LA houses, I think it was in 2022, I was sitting next to the woman who runs LASA, which is a homeless response system in LA. You want to talk about a hard job? Unbelievable. I think she said they got 15,000 to 20,000 people into housing in 1 year out of their homeless response system. A rousing success. And 25,000 or 30,000 people entered homelessness. And so the LA Times then writes a story and says homelessness went up by 10,000 people in LA. And everyone sitting in a room like this in LA is just like, oh, we worked our asses off, and now the LA Times is writing a story about how homelessness went up by 5,000 or 10,000 people. So the work we're doing does actually have a positive impact. We would be much worse off in LA had we not been doing this. LA passed Proposition HHH, $1 billion. I was at UCLA giving a talk, and they said, it didn't end homelessness. I was like, you're right. Because you got a $50 billion problem, and you threw $1 billion at it, and you're surprised it didn't work? We have a scale problem. So what concerns me as someone who studies public policy is when we have interventions at this level and a problem at that level, everyone can say, well, the interventions don't work. It's the exact same as you getting an infection, going to the doctor, getting a 2-week course of antibiotics, taking it for 2 days and say, I'm still sick, and antibiotics don't work. That's the wrong interpretation. You had an insufficient dosage. Antibiotics do work. We have an insufficient dosage in many of our communities, and as a result, this issue is continuing to go up. What we've not done as a nation is we have not prioritized investments upstream to prevent homelessness. Generally speaking, what we do is we wait for Gregg to show up at the doorstep of the shelter and say, welcome to the crisis response system, and we're going to provide you services and housing. And that is life-saving work. Absolutely life-saving work, and that should continue. But we're fooling ourselves if that is in any way an attempt to end homelessness. It is responding to the crisis, it's not intervening upstream. We've not made capital investments in our nation upstream to provide housing for people such that they don't end up at the shelter door. And we're living with the responses of that. And you all in the CoC are tasked with responding to that. And it's hard work. So who should do this? Should we build a bunch of housing? Should private market developers build a bunch of housing? Yes. Do we need philanthropic organizations and the public sector to provide resources to provide housing that's more affordable? Yes. We need it all. There's not a single silver bullet here. Allowing private market developers to build a whole bunch of housing is absolutely necessary, and we should create a regulatory environment that allows that to happen. That alone will not end this crisis. But fixing the crisis without adequate housing is really hard. So I get accused of being a shill for corporate interests in this talk because I am promoting private market development, and then other people call me a socialist because I think that the government has a responsibility in this. I don't think either of those are true. It's kind of entertaining. I firmly believe that there is not, and I spent the first 17 years of my life as an investment banker. I understand financial models. I understand how to allocate capital and make a return. When people get angry with me, this goes in the email slot, developers saying, how dare you suggest that there's a public role here? I'll say, show me your financial model, how you can build housing and charge someone $300 a month and make a return. Well, it doesn't work. I'm like, you're right. So we can either stick our heads in the sand and say, well, we'll let the market figure it out, and there's not a solution, and it doesn't mean developers are bad, or we can say there are going to be people in society who cannot afford market rents. That's just a statement of fact. And then we collectively have to decide what is our societal response. To date, the societal response has been tough crap. And we're living with the consequences of that. So I think we can have this conversation without a lot of ideology to just say, we have an income distribution. Right now, the private housing market serves the top 40% really well. It served my family really well. It hasn't served a lot of other families. What are we going to do different? And unfortunately, what we've done is we've kept doing the same thing over and over and over again, which produces the exact same results. That doesn't need to be, in my opinion, a right versus left argument. It's just a statement of fact. So the purpose of the book was hopefully that we will then take the time and attention off of Joe on the street. Because if I walk by Joe and I see people experiencing homelessness every day in Seattle when I go to work, and if I see Joe and say, I feel bad for Joe, but Joe made some poor decisions, I can go about my day and absolve myself of responsibility. If instead I see Joe as a consequence of structures that I, Gregg Colburn, have contributed to, then it forces me to look in the mirror and say, well, then what's Gregg going to do? And what are all of us in this room going to do? And what are all the people in Sedgwick County going to do? And that's scary because that then indicts all of us to a certain extent. This is a structural problem. The scary thing about structural problems is they require structural solutions, which frequently require a lot of political will and resources and investment. And that's something that, unfortunately, in our nation has been in short supply of late. Okay. I firmly believe that if we continue to blame Joe, we will not end this crisis, and in fact, it'll get worse. We have to change the way that we think about this. So the final pushback that I'll get from people is Gregg, I just saw Joe on the street. There was a needle right next to him. Joe's a mess. Hard words to hear, but I hear this all the time. I'm not convinced housing is going to help Joe. You're out here just saying it's housing? Obviously it's not. Joe has a lot of other conditions. What I'll say is, I understand your concerns, but we've done it. As a nation, we've done it. As a county, as a CoC, you've done it. We cut veteran homelessness at the national level by 50% in 10 years. And how do we do it? We provided housing for people. Some people just need a voucher and they're off to the races. Other people have really severe PTSD and behavioral health disorders and they need lots of services. And we provided housing and services and we cut it by 50%. So to suggest that these interventions don't work is just false. We have the data to demonstrate that in fact they do. What we've not done is scaled those investments and provided the same logic to people who didn't serve in the armed forces. And I'm all for ending veteran homelessness. My dad's a veteran, my grandpa's a veteran, but I also don't think other people should be homeless either. and we know it works. The question is, will we extend these services to a broader population? So to date, the answer to these questions has been no as a society, and we're living with the responses. My hope is that we'll make different decisions going forward. And you have the luxury in your community of getting to zero. This is an absolutely tangible problem that you can solve. Seattle, we're not going to get there anytime soon. You can. And I wish you well in your work, and I really appreciate your attention, and I wish you well. Thanks.